Stockholm, Sweden. Hi, I'm Lori, a senior solo traveler, and I recently spent a little over a day in Stockholm. The trip started out wonderfully, but later took a turn for the worse. I'll share my experiences with you, both the good, the bad, and the inconvenient, so that you can get an honest view of my experience as a senior solo traveler. Here goes! I arrived in Stockholm late after a flight delay and started my touring the next day. When I woke in the morning, I discovered the hotel I had booked was an historic 400-year-old converted stable. It was quite charming, however, it was definitely not convenient to public transportation. I spent some time figuring out the best way to get to the heart of the city. I walked about a mile around some construction, past some interesting buildings, and eventually arrived at the Odenplan metro stop. Next to it is the Gustaf Vasa Church, which is quite an impressive-looking building. I then took the metro down to Gamla Stan, which is the bustling old town with cobblestone streets and gorgeous historic architecture. I had an 11 a.m. free walking tour booked, but I had a couple hours to explore prior to the tour. I started by just following my eyes, which led me down some beautiful narrow streets. I love getting out early when exploring cities because at this time in the morning, the streets were somewhat empty. Eventually, I saw this building, which I learned was the Swedish House of Nobility built in the 1600s. Across the way was the Riddarholmen Church with some impressive spires. As I walked, I took in all the amazing architecture, which had some fascinating details. Eventually, I ran into the Parliament House of Sweden. I'll let you pronounce it. The building is just stunning, and I had to cross the waters to get a closer look. Gamla Stan is on an island, so it was on the other side of a waterway. The views from the bridge were wonderful. I walked through the Parliament building and eventually was led to the statue of Gustaf Adolf's Torg, which is a square and statue named after King Gustaf II Adolf. Behind it was the impressive Opera House. There was a church that caught my eye on the way. I learned later it was the St. James Church. Behind the church is the Kungstradgarden park, which is a long park with several statues and fountains. It is lined with numerous outdoor cafes and seemed like it would be a central hub of activity later in the day. As I kept walking, the views were more lovely, culminating in a rectangular pool with fountains. Very striking. At this point, I had to head back to Gamla Stan for the walking tour, so I crossed over the water again, this time on a different bridge, passing by the Royal Palace on my way to the Storkyrkran, or main plaza. I immediately recognized some of the buildings I had seen in pictures of Stockholm, bright and colorful structures surrounding the square. Very charming. The tour I had signed up was focused on Viking history and led by a charismatic storyteller. He led us around Gamla Stan, sharing fun history along the way. Here are a few things I learned. These spouts on some of the buildings were used to throw fecal waste out of the buildings. When the streets became too pungent, the king ordered them stopped up, which didn't help because people just threw their excrement out the windows. There are numerous rune stones around the city. On this one, the letters around the edge revealed a husband, wife, and son tribute. I asked the guide if the red on the stone was original, and he said that it had to be repainted regularly, and that there was one person whose sole job it was to walk around repainting rune stones in the correct historical pigment. Not a bad job. We stopped by the St. George and the Dragon sculpture, the Royal Palace, and the Storkyrkran. He shared stories of the history, all involving Vikings. One important point he made was that most of the early history of Stockholm was lost when the archives in the Royal Palace perished in a fire, so there is limited written history of Stockholm. In this day of cloud storage and digital backup, it's interesting to learn that so much important historical information could vanish in one fire. There are many other places we visited, but those are the places that stood out. We finished in front of this tiny sculpture, which has this name that I can't pronounce. It is also known as the Iron Boy, so I'll go with that. The Iron Boy, which is only 15 centimeters high, is the smallest public monument in Stockholm. The sculpture was created in 1954 by the Swedish artist Lis Eriksson. Tradition has it that if you place a coin or gift here and rub its head, you will either have a wish come true, get pregnant, or be the beneficiary of some other magic. I'm not one to believe in mysticism, but when the tour guide gave me a strange coin as a gift, I left it at the boy's feet and rubbed its head, and of course made a wish. By the end of the tour, it had started to sprinkle. I found a cafe that I had passed by earlier and decided to get something to eat while I figured out my next move. I had heard that artists were commissioned to decorate many of the subway stations in Stockholm, so I headed to the T Central station to check it out. It was worth the trek. The ceilings were textured and covered with painted leaves. Just wonderful. Unfortunately, that pretty much completed my touring in Stockholm. I had planned to go back to my hotel, grab my power bank to charge up my phone, and then head out again. However, when I emerged from the subway, it was a deluge. I was soaked by the time I walked back to the hotel, and it didn't let up for the rest of the night. I was just glad I had the lovely morning to see so much of the old town. Stockholm truly is a gorgeous city. I would recommend staying at a place within easy walking distance to the metro or Gamla Stan. Buses are another option, but when I researched for routes from my hotel, I always had to transfer a few times to get where I was going. For senior and solo travelers, Stockholm is one of the safest cities in Europe, and I found everyone friendly and helpful. For senior travelers, the streets where I walked were mostly flat with a little elevation change. However, for anyone with limited mobility, just know that the cobblestone streets have uneven surfaces. As always, if you have questions, feel free to ask in the comments section. And if you've been to Stockholm, especially with better weather, please share your experiences. We'd love to hear from you. Check out the Senior Solo Travel website where all my videos are laid out in an easy-to-access format, and the Travel Facebook forum where you can interact with other travelers. I have left links to those sites as well as others from the Scandinavian and Baltic Trip in the description below. And if you'd like to follow my senior and solo travel journeys, please like and subscribe. Next stop, Helsinki, Finland.